Let's talk about contrast. Contrast is the differences between the lights and the darks in an image. Taking a look on the screen here, ignoring the file names, which in retrospect I should probably change, which of these is a high contrast image and which of these is a low contrast image? The one on the left, high or low contrast? Yeah, you got a lot of really bright areas and some really dark areas. What about this one, high or low? Low contrast. So there's not a lot of difference between the bright areas and the shadows. Can we change that? Can we play around with those images? We can, can't we? Like, let's say that image on the right, the low contrast image. The client called and said, it's great, but we want it to be a little bit snappier, a little bit more oomph. If we were to look at the histogram for this image, what do we think it would look like? Anybody know what a histogram is? Let's talk about histograms for a second. Take a look on the screen. I'm just going to throw up a histogram here. Levels. And this is a graph that shows the distribution of tones within this image. And it looks like some kind of weird, I don't know, alien snail or something. But if you look at the image, there's nothing really black in this image. There's some moderately dark areas, I guess, but there's nothing that's black. From black to white, there's numerical values that are assigned. In a typical Photoshop image, what are the values for black? 0, no light. And then you're adding different amounts of light. What's the value for white? Anybody know? 255. There's 256 shades of gray if you want 1 to 256, but they want black to be 0, so it's 0 to 255. So there's nothing down here in black. And look at this histogram. Here's the black point, here's the white point, and sure enough, there's no tonality down here. This part of the histogram, this little mountain range over here, the darkest pixel in this image is just a little bit darker than right in between black and white. This is called 50% gray. And sure enough, the darkest pixel, which is probably somewhere around in here, kind of a mid-gray, isn't it? It's right in between black and white. And then most of the image is kind of pushed towards the right side here. We got a big amount of whatever this is. What part of the image do you think this part of the histogram represents? Well, it's obviously the brightest part. So in this case, it would be the sky around. So this little lump over here would be the tree. We got some brighter areas, which would be up around in here. We got some darker areas, very few darker areas. And sure enough, there's those few darker areas. But if I wanted to change the contrast on that, if the client said, it's not quite the image we're looking for, I mean, that's what it actually looked like. It was a bit of a hazy day, low contrast. There wasn't a lot of difference between the highlights. And if you're there walking, that's pretty much what you'd see. But take a look at this. Notice we have 0 down here at black, 255 up here at white, and these little sliders, these endpoint sliders. If I were to pull these inward, take a look at what happens. I can reassign where black is on that graph. So if I grab this black point down here and I start hefting it to the right, I'm reassigning black. And here I've told it, okay, 120 is now black. So whatever used to have a value of 120, which was this darkest pixel, which is probably somewhere around in here, is now black. And I could do the same thing for the highlights. I could say, okay, well, whatever the brightest pixel is in there, let's make that pixel white. I could grab this point, drag it down, and I've effectively changed the contrast of this image. Could I do the same thing to this image over here? I could. Let's take a look at that. If I call it my histogram here, if I pull my black point up, my blacks get darker. See all this tonality around here? This all became black. Any of that tonality on the histogram that ends up to the left of that black point becomes black. If I went the other way, any of the tonality that ends up to the right of the white point becomes white. A way to think about these shades of gray, I might have mentioned this before. Imagine an elastic string, and on this string you have 256 glass beads. A black bead down here at 0, a white bead up here at 255. And I said, if you wanted to make the image brighter or darker, you could grab that middle bead, start pulling it to the left or the right, and some of the beads, or some of those shades of gray, would pop off the string. You're doing damage to the file. But in this case, pulling this black point up, reassigning where black is, simply fills in the shadows. But imagine if I could take this black point and pull it out to the left here so that there was a big flat spot. Remember what the flat spot did on the tree image? It meant that there was no pure blacks, just kind of grayish in the dark areas. If I could pull this out to here, I would have the same sort of grayishness. The darkest pixel right now, which is at 0, if I pulled that black point out to here, would be in between white and black. It would be, 128-ish. But I can't pull this point out here. These are my input levels, but look down here, output levels. If I pull this slider to the right, it's basically the same thing as pulling this slider out to the left. And watch what happens to the shadows in this image. we start getting that nice kind of washed out look. It's like a fog is rolling in. And same deal on the highlights. If I pull this down, we get that nice washed out look in the highlights. Kind of a grayishness in there. So I basically swapped the contrast of these two images. Let's get you guys playing around with that. Once you get the files, pop into the folder called contrast, and there's an image in there called lab file. And let's get you guys playing around with contrast. So go into that folder called contrast. There's some cross-country skiers in there, and their contrast is a little bit low. You'll notice that there's no pure blacks in the image, there's no pure whites in the image. Let's make a levels change. So go under Image, Adjustments, Levels, or the keyboard shortcut is Command L. And you'll see on the histogram those flat spots at the end there. Give it a try. Grab the little sliders, little black point there, pull it up a bit, and the white point, pull it down. And if you want to see a before and after without actually applying it, you can click that little preview check mark off and on and see a before and after. And when it looks good, hit OK. Now you don't want to pull those endpoints too far. Take a look on the screen and see what happens if I went a little too far on this. See the trees on the left there? We can see some shadow information there. We can see some detail. Watch what happens if I pull these shadows up too high. Look at what's happening. These areas are starting to fill in. We know then that these parts on the very left, see where they've become black? Look at that. They were darker originally than 67 on that 0 to 255 scale. And there's that tonality for those trees in there. And if I pull it up even farther, more and more of those darker pixels are going to become black. Same thing for the highlights. If I pull my whites down, right now I can see lots of nice detail in that snow there, but if I start pulling my white point down, all of that starts to blow out. And we could end up with a crazy high contrast image. It's not to say this is a bad thing. How many people remember the 1960s? No, okay. There was that kind of a pop art movement where they did these really high contrast poster sort of effects. Andy Warhol did one of Marilyn Monroe with all those different colors in there. You don't have to have full tonality in an image. If you're trying to achieve something like this, that could be just fine. But let's pull it up just to the point where we clean up those highlights and the shadows. And when you're done, hit OK. Now, one of the things about making changes to an image is it does do damage to the file. If you call up those levels again, or I've called it up on the screen here, look at these little gaps. See these little marks in here. That's a result of, like I said, imagine there's an elastic string, and all those shades of gray, from the darkest black to the brightest white, are glass beads on that string. With 256 shades of gray, it's enough for what we call continuous tone. So the gray ramp from black to white would be continuous. You wouldn't see any difference. Any two beads side by side or any two shades of gray on that histogram look to be pretty much the same. You pretty much can't tell them apart. But by pulling those endpoints, we've done some damage to that file, and you can see that damage starting to occur. One of the things we're going to take a look at today is another aspect of non-destructive imaging, which are adjustment layers. And we'll kind of go through a bunch of them. Some of them are less useful than others. We'll go through the main ones, but let's take a look at adjustment layers. Once you've got that done, hit OK and save it into a folder. Make a new folder. I guess on the desktop is a good place to throw it. And in this case, a JPEG is fine, because there's no layers on this, and it's not like we're going to be opening up and doing more work on it, so a JPEG is fine for that.